design thinking, or applying design process to public policy organizations in life. That is because design thinking is like a trendy term, and I'm not a big fan of like contemporarily trendy terms, because usually like in retrospect they look dumb. Usually in retrospect, like the terms that catch are like ones that people don't think about. And people like to say it, so I would rather just talk about like how do we apply design process to other areas outside like the traditional realms of design, right? That's basically what we're talking about. So this is like, for me, especially talking about public policy, I think it's particularly interesting right now. Not really interesting, just like important, right? With some of the kind of current events, right? Like if you have any major news site, what's going to be like the #1 thing on the homepage is people kind of categorizing, like sort of casting a wide net over all the issues in Baltimore and shining a light on like riots and stuff like that, right? So this is particularly pertinent, I think, right now we're going to talk about, because I think it gives us a system to understand kind of like how like a better framework for how to think about addressing problems, right? So I'm gonna start with this picture, right? So this is a sketch, like this is like some rendering someone did, right? Inspired by a book called All Quiet on the Western Front. How many of you guys have read this book? Okay, a lot of you. I can remember reading this in high school and having a particularly like visceral reaction to one of the scenes, and you might remember this, where basically Paul is in this foxhole because there's this forest getting shelled, right? And he jumps this foxhole, and then one of these enemy combatants hops in the foxhole, thinking no one's in there. He just out of instinct grabs his knife, stabs this guy, and just instinctively does it, right? Doesn't think twice. Thank you. So he doesn't think twice, right, about stabbing this guy. But then, like, as the forest continues to get shelled, like, he has to spend multiple days with this man in this foxhole, and it's this traumatic experience, because over time he's thinking to himself, well, maybe I could have just kind of subdued this guy. Do I really need to kill him? No, I was right to kill him, right? And then he starts thinking, like, oh my God, like, this is a person, right? Like, I killed a person. This person is here, right? Like, I wonder who he was. Like, I wonder if he has a family. He probably doesn't have a family. He looks really young. He takes out his wallet, sees a picture of him and his wife and his kids, and he's thinking, oh my God, like, I killed a father. Like, how could I have done this? Like, but then he reminds himself, well, this was what I was supposed to do. And then, you know, he starts thinking to himself, well, maybe if I get the address, I could find him, and after the war, I'll send money, I'll help support him. He starts to feel culpable for what happened. And then he kind of starts speaking to this man openly, not just thinking. He speaks to him after after a while spending in this foxhole, saying to him, you know, like, you were just an abstraction in my mind, and now I see, like, you know, if I would have known you, we could have been comrades, we could have been brothers, right? So he's basically saying, like, over time, his view of this guy shifts from just this abstract kind of force that's aligned against him to realizing over time, like, oh my God, this is another human, and this person had this little connection to, like, the conflicts that our governments are engaged in, as I do, right? Because with World War I, it was particularly, like, the people actually fighting were particularly divorced from the actual issues at hand, which is kind of unique, which you hadn't really seen that in modern warfare since, like, you know, like the freaking, like, 100 Years War, where, like, someone would piss on someone's lawn and kings, and they would just, you know, fuck each other up. But yeah, so it was really bad, and, you know, like I said, they both were completely disconnected from the conflict, and yet they just knew to hate each other and kill each other. So the reason I bring this up is because, to me, this is like a really incredibly important, like, thought exercise. Whenever you're kind of up against some system of thought that you don't agree with or you don't understand, it's just to remember that, like, this is like another person, and, like, my view of them will, like, could totally change based on just a slightly different perspective on this, whatever the issue is, right? So, this is a Chemex coffee maker, right? This is, I use this every day. This is an opinionated object, in my opinion, right? So there's a lot of, like, opinion that goes into this that, you know, like, basically, this is not a suitable product for a lot of people to use. I love this product because it's good for me, right? Everyone loves opinionated products that are for them. So I bring this up because I find in my mind, I hold these two ideals very high up that are seemingly at odds, right? Which is this idea of, like, a design should be opinionated, right? Because, like, design for the masses is usually shitty, which is kind of true, right? But, like, I really appreciate opinionated design because good design is usually opinionated, you know, like, but then we also have this, right, which is like this is like the every person coffee maker. This is what everyone uses. This is the populist coffee maker. This is what, you know, anyone can use. This appeals to a lot of people, but it's not very good. But I believe strongly that everyone should have access to make coffee, right, even if it sucks. So I feel particularly strongly about this because of an experience I have, which I'll talk about. But I don't really know how to reconcile this idea that things should be opinionated and things should be good quality and really good and suitable for the market that they're trying for, but also this idea that everyone deserves a fair shake, everyone deserves access to something, right? This is, I think, a better, like a kind of a more relatable example for a lot of people in the room, right? So Evernote, I use it, it's horrible, the worst, absolutely the worst. It's like a Swiss Army knife, like for someone who like needs a can opener, you know, like it's the worst. But I use it all the time, right? Because it's ubiquitous, it just does a lot of things, but it's not particularly good, right? Then you have Vesper, which is made by John Gruber and Co., and it's incredibly opinionated, and it's good. Well, it's okay, it's opinionated. It doesn't really suit my needs, because I need to be able to just toss arbitrary images and stuff, or actually give headings to things, unlike just being able to put like paragraph text. So it's not suitable, but I admire it because it's opinionated, and they took a stance and they said, we want to make a note-taking app that doesn't try to be a Swiss Army knife. So in this case, whereas the Chemex suited me before, Evernote suits me in this case and not Vesper just because of my own note-taking needs, yet I still admire it, right? But how do I reconcile this? How do we reconcile this idea that things should be good and opinionated, but also that things should be available for everyone? So this was an experience I had that kind of made me really question, that made me think that everyone should have access to everything, right? So this is somewhere between senior year and freshman year in college. I had the opportunity to spend like most of the summer at a hospital in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, and I was like doing IT shit at the hospital, and I like played basketball with these kids at this orphanage, and it was like pretty like jarring and made me like in general very, very cynical. And this was what started to make me really think that like people deserve access to things, right? Because there's this like disparity, obviously in economics, but there's also like the idea of the disparity of access to agency to kind of gain upward mobility. It's not just like you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and like really it's difficult for some people to even gain access to the means to do that. And I really discovered this here where I was just like showing people how to use Photoshop, and they had like this print shop where they like did like screen printing for people, and like as I was there for an hour teaching them how to like remove the background image around a person so they could put their picture on like a photo ID sort of card, the power went out like 3 times, and they had like 7 hard drives in this desktop that they had built. That was like, each was like 11 or 12 gigs, and it was only a few years ago, so like that's like it was kind of ridiculous. And it was just like, they were super generous, super kind, and they were just so excited that I was teaching them things about how to use Photoshop whenever. They were like, oh my gosh, like, you know, if you lived in Addis, you would be really rich. And I was like thinking to myself, like, that's like ridiculous, because like just by virtue of me having the means to like buy a plane ticket to come here, like I'm obviously, like relatively speaking, like fucking loaded, right? Like I don't think of myself as a rich person, but obviously relative to the circumstances in which I was in, I was incredibly wealthy. And even by, in this country's standards, we're all, you know, like mostly I'd say, we're very wealthy compared to, you know, like some other folks. So it kind of made me really question like this idea of like things should be opinionated and fuck anyone who doesn't like something. Because it's like, well, these folks don't have the means to like really learn, and I was giving them the means and they were, you know, eating it up. And then like, how did I learn? Like I just dicked around on the internet all day when I was a kid and like watched videos and listened to podcasts and kind of just figured things out. But this was not even a possibility for them. You know, the bandwidth was like less than a meg down for like rich folks, and it was like exorbitantly priced, and there were outages. The government controlled all telecom, so like your emails would get flagged if you put the word Skype in, or like anything related to public policy, because like the elections are all rigged and shit. It's crazy. So like they just don't have the means, right? And it's not coming anytime soon. So like really, if we have like Silicon Valley sort of like our technology continues to progress at such a rate, like obviously not only is there existing economic disparity, but the access and the educational possibilities is kind of, you know, diverging as well. So like this guy in this book, this guy's name is Victor Papanek. He writes a book called Design for the Real World, which I have here. And this book like totally changed my thinking about this, like, and helped me give in a framework of how to understand this disparity, right? So this is like a really great, really like well quoted thing of his. He talks about how industrial design today is corrupted, right? And today being 1970. So he's like railing against the establishment and like marketing, and that like you shouldn't need to market products because products should be meeting a need. So their purpose should be self-evident, all this stuff. And so I'm just going to highlight a couple quotes. So there's this really long one, and basically I will summarize what he's saying here because I just copied and pasted it on a blog, like a paper I read. And so what he basically says is that like there's this idea that by designing for like social good, we're like designing for minorities. We're like going outside of ourselves to be selfless. When in reality, his point when he's saying all this is you're really not, right? Like all of us have problems. Everyone is going to lose their sight, or maybe has bad sight as it is, right? Like everyone could be disabled. Everyone has family, has loved ones that have problems, right? Like, even a ridiculous kind of example would be like, everyone is going to spend time away from good cellular connections, right? So like, if you design products that like rely super heavily on like a network connection, and you're in a place that's like you're just out on the road and you don't have it, like that thing really sucks now, right? So if you're designing for someone in rural Africa that has limited access to like networking, you're also designing for yourself when you're on vacation and you're away from a cell network, right? So there's this idea that you can actually provide yourself a selfish framework to think about doing social good, right? Which is that you're not really designing for minorities, you're designing for yourself, you're designing for a future self or a loved one, right? And this was a really compelling way for me to kind of actually construct a cohesive way of thinking about doing good, which is, obviously, it's kind of like ridiculous that it has to be a selfish one, but as people, I think we are just at our core very selfish. So I think this helped me think about that when I'm doing things that are positive, it's not really just for other people, but it's because I understand that I'm going to be on the receiving end of this as well. And the other thing he hits on, which is really interesting, is that last quote: to deprive ourselves of the brain and potential of any person on our spaceship, so he talks about this spaceship called Earth, is wrong and no longer acceptable. That's another interesting idea, that like all the problems the world's facing, whether it's climate change, policy issues, everything, like we need as many people, not like as many humans, God forbid, like population's out of control, but we need as many like people with resources and access to create ideas. We need as many of them as possible to really work on these super hard problems. So when we have like whole segments of the world that are out of reach of education, then like necessarily we have like limited ability to solve a lot of these huge problems. Also, like unrelated, but like as standards of living go up, populations, typically fertility decreases. So like bringing people out of poverty in terms of actually population concerns is usually a good thing. So this helped me think about it. So okay, so now we've covered, so like I wanted to set this because this is a premise, right? So like if I talk about doing good and design for public policy, that's kind of based on a premise that social good is a good thing, right? Which like is up for debate. So that's why I kind of want to lay this groundwork of like, this is why I think you can do social good, and it's sort of a cohesive premise. So this is a Stringer Bell. This is from my favorite television show, The Wire, and he is a businessman in Baltimore. Coincidentally, I had this picked out before all this stuff happened. But so he's a businessman. He works in selling products, dope, and among other things. And he, right now, you see he's in a room, right? He's wearing glasses, wearing clothing, sitting at a desk, maybe reading something. So Stringer really is like on the receiving end of a whole bunch of different design disciplines, which we covered last week, right? So if you think about like, you know, he is, so let's think about like this big concentric circle of existence, right? So Stringer's in this room, he's looking at things, whatever. At the base level, you have like, right, so we're talking about design disciplines. You have graphic design. So Stringer's reading a book. That's typographically set, that's typography, that's graphic design. There are things hung on the walls that are designed, right? You walk down the street, things are designed, advertisements, whatever, right? So then you also have industrial design. He's wearing glasses, he's wearing clothing, he's sitting on furniture, he's at a desk. How is that stuff designed, right? So graphic design sort of peripherally affects him. Industrial design affects him as well, right? And then architecture, he's inside his building, right? What is the state of the building? Is the building conducive to his business goals, etc.? So these things are really, really affecting his existence. But what about this space, right? What about the ideas and the policy and the culture that governs all three of these other circles? So in this case, I'm talking about public policy, right? So like, how is a building zoned? What buildings are allowed to be built? Like, you know, like why is Stringer selling drugs, right? Like, why does Stringer have to provide for his family in that manner? And why is that the most reasonable solution for this guy to wind up with, right? So architecture, industrial design, graphic design, fixing those things don't solve these problems of like, you know, like you can make things better graphically, you can make things more comfortable, you can make buildings more livable and more energy efficient. But at the end of the day, like what about the design of these other things, right? Like who are the designers working in this huge space that ultimately governs the way all this stuff is made, right? And that would be like politicians and policymakers, like some of the worst people in the whole world, right? Like some of the worst humans are the ones designing the things, the forces that are ultimately governing all these other circles. So we have like, you know, people we really admire, maybe some like stuck-up douches or whatever in these three circles, but you know, they make cool things. But like this huge space is policy, and it's kind of a bummer that people are so bad and like politicians don't care about, like, are beholden to like whatever. It's just bad. So how can we think about policy in a different way? How can we apply design process to policy and organizations and stuff like that? So a quick recap of last week, we talked about like defining design process. How does design occur? Research, right? Ideate, prototype, build, evaluate, repeat. So we're going to talk about how we apply this to like big, huge problems. And this is where I need Rocco's video device. Oh. So I'm going to show a short clip from a movie called Urbanized, which is about like architecture and urban, like city planning and stuff. And this particular clip I'm going to show is a interview in section with the former mayor of Bogota in Colombia.
And the most obvious way of restricting car use is restricting parking. People seem to imagine that parking is a right, almost a fundamental right, to be included in the United Nations Charter. In our Constitution, there are many rights. The right to housing, the right to education, the right to health, but I don't find the right to park. I don't see any constitution which includes the right to park. So if you ask me where you should park, the mayor can tell them. It's almost as if you ask me where you should put your food or your clothes. This is not a government problem. Before I was mayor, I have never been in a city which hated itself more than Bogota. There was a total lack of self-esteem and lack of hope. So when I was elected mayor, we started investing in people, in sidewalks, in parks, in great schools, in libraries, and also we created a bus-based public transport system. We copied a system from Curitiba, a small city in Brazil. We call it Transmilenio. We give it a name because buses in most places have a stigma, a bad image of being for the poor, so we have to raise the bus status. Transmilenio bus system actually works much more like a subway on wheels than like a traditional bus. Buses go on exclusive lanes. People pay when they enter the station. When the buses arrive, the station doors open simultaneously with the bus door. You can get 100 people out and 100 people into the bus in seconds. Many people stay up to 2 hours a day because before they have to be on traditional buses in the traffic jam, and now they can go from one extreme to the other very fast. For the same cost that we could do a 25-kilometer subway, we do 400 kilometers of Transmilenio. These systems are also more flexible. Younger cities don't have such a defined center, and the center is shifting. So if you put a hugely expensive infrastructure such as a subway line, then you may find that the new center in another 20 or 30 years is somewhere else where the subway line doesn't go. This system is very powerful signal of democracy. The first article in every constitution says that, the first article in every constitution says that all citizens are equal before the law. This is not just poetry. It means, for example, that a bus with 100 passengers has a right to 100 times more road space than a car with one. He said, democracy at war. You can really see that public good prevails over private interest. Okay, here we are in part of the Porvenir Promenade. This is a 24-kilometer pedestrian and bicycle-only street which networks very low-income neighborhoods to the richest areas of the city. I think it's a revolution in the way urban life works. This kind of high-quality infrastructure for bicycles increases the social status of cyclists. Before we had bicycle ways, low-income people were ashamed of using bicycles. Now, a high-quality, protected bicycle way shows that a citizen on a $30 bicycle is equally important to one on a $30,000 car. And here is something interesting. You can see how the pedestrian and bicycle has pavement and the cars are in the mud. So it's a priority for the pedestrian and for the bicycles, and then later sometime we will pay for the cars. But first, the pedestrian. So this completely shows respect for human dignity, for everybody, not just for those who have cars, who normally think they are the important ones in developing country cities. Again, this is democracy at work. Buenas tardes, ¿cómo les va?
Okay, so I find that clip particularly interesting as an example. Okay, so like, I love that because, like, remember we talked before last week about like the idea of solutions and problems, and like you don't want a solution in search of a problem, you want to identify the problem and then understand and develop like a solution to it, right? So like in this case, I really love the point about subways where he talks about like an urban center changing. That's one of those things that like you have to learn, right? Like you find that out the hard way. You have some city with an incredibly expensive subway line and you find out that it's like not very particularly helpful, right? So like if you put in a subway line, that's a solution in search of a problem, right? That's the assumption you're making is a number of things. One, that people prefer subways, that subways are the best way for anyone or low-income folks to get around even, that the urban center of the city is going to be the same over time. Like, you have all these number of assumptions, and yet people, you still see it. Like in Toronto, they would have this big fight of, oh, put in a subway, whatever. And it's like, again, that is a solution, right? But you need, like, is that actually solving the right problem? In this case, like, I love this solution because the problem that I identify is not necessarily just like, oh, transportation is bad, but like, well, what are the sort of like peripheral effects of transportation, right? You have low-income folks not able to get to, when he talks about connecting the wealthy and the poor parts of the city, that's really interesting because like, that's sort of the idea of mobility, not just in not a literal sense, but in an economic sense as well. Like, connecting folks from the circumstances they're in to the circumstances they might want to be in if they're able to kind of now get a job, doesn't cost a ridiculous amount or take a ridiculous amount of time to get to work, right? And it's also the idea of like, these people are not like, it's just unrealistic for them to maybe get a car and sort of, you know, traverse the horrible system there. And the bus system is really interesting too. That's a really interesting design solution of like, okay, the city's still developing, so like how can we create a flexible system now? And then the idea of like giving them equal road space. So like that's super transformative, not just in a way of people getting from point A to point B, but people are starting to feel better about themselves. They're not feeling stigmatized by the culture, and then actually it might motivate them, it might give them some sense of agency. And also, if the bus is actually faster than a car, you might have like higher income folks with lower income folks, and then you sort of have that like, you know, Paul in the pit experience, right? Where you put people in a foxhole together, people who seemingly have competing ideals, competing circumstances, and they're able to understand that, they're able to kind of understand one another. So I think like assumptions are a really interesting idea because it's like a key idea in design, as opposed to like sort of in engineering. Like one of the books I recommend is Change by Design, which is where the design thinking term comes from. Tim Brown, the author, talks about kind of like how engineering sort of fundamentally is like solve for X, right? Like there's sort of a defined problem, whereas design is like you have a kind of abstract problem that sort of seems simple in nature, but you discover like all these assumptions along the way that you didn't realize you had. So like really simple examples, right? Like this was something recently I thought was like super fascinating assumption. Like we were designing brochures in class, and this was obviously like just whatever, with a bunch of squares in. We were designing brochures in class, and we designed it for these people, and they were like, yeah, we really love it, because this was a team of us, they're like, we really love what you guys came up with. It was not this. We really love what you guys came up with, but there's one problem. We're like, what? They're like, well, you know, brochure stands are about yay high, and like the graphic and the title on your thing, like, wouldn't clear it when it's put in a rack of brochures, and we learned this the hard way. And that was like, blew my mind, because like, oh my god, that's one of those things you don't realize until you actually go through the process of putting a brochure into a rack of brochures. Like, never when you're designing are you thinking about, not never, you should be, but you're rarely thinking about the context in which something like a design is actually going to be applied. Which is why it's super important to prototype, it's super important to get like the lowest fidelity thing out there to validate your assumptions, right? So you talk about like, we talk about like agile, whatever, agile development in software. That's a little different, but it's still the same idea that like you want to get something out the door quickly because then you can start to validate your ideas and test your assumptions, right? Here's another one very recently. So this is a movie me and some of my friends are working on. So super quickly, I don't really have time to like illustrate it well. I just literally took a screenshot of the sketchboard. So basically, like there are two tabs that are shown here. Like it's basically like list of movies you want to watch, list of movies you've watched, right? And so me and my friend Zach were working on this, and we were like, okay, well, what view are we going to use for? I'm gonna like actually, how can I point with this? There's like a thing you can point with this, right, Carl? Or
yeah, you can like draw on
with your finger.
Yeah.
There's a little
See the top right? There's like an arrow.
Whoa.
Yeah.
All right. What do I use?
The pencil.
Pencil. Look at that. Okay. How do I undo it? Like this. Nice. Okay. So if you see, like here are like the two active tabs. Like these two belong to the same tab. And these two belong to the same tab, right? So like if you tap on Derek in this view, you get this view, right? So then like, right? You might wonder, well, what happens when you tap one of these two views, right? So we were like, oh, well, we don't need to mock it up, right? We'll just use the exact same view here, right? But like, does anyone see the problem of us not testing these ideas and kind of allowing yourself to mentally interpolate the two? Yeah.
Well, I presume if I click on either of those and I go see the movie, like if I click back, like I presume do you go back to the previous?
It's even simpler than that. It's even simpler than that. Okay, look, we have this filter icon here because this is like the primary screen, right? This is the first screen when you hit this tab, but this one is not, right? Like over here, it is like the third or fourth, right? So you have this to get back, right? And like we're assuming that this view here is going to work, right? But like when you have it nested in all those nav controllers, like then you have things that, like it just fundamentally doesn't work, right? So it was like I was being lazy and like, oh, we don't need to mock up how everything works. But then once you actually build the app, you're like, wait a second. Like the icon, like where we were going to keep filtering in the entire product fundamentally doesn't work because this view is sometimes shown in a view hierarchy that is not what I assumed it to be, right? So it's kind of like a nuanced thing, but it's one of those things that like, that's why it's super important to not just like let your mind, that's why prototype, especially in software, is super important because if you design a frame and a frame, you're like allowing your mind and other people's mind to like interpolate how does that transition, right? Like here, I'm basically trusting everyone to like understand this is how these two frames are interpolated, but like what actually happens, right? There's like a whole huge territory of space in that, in betwixt, right? So assumptions are important, right? Now I talk about that because, whoa, is it still up there?
Yeah, you have to erase it.
Is there like a clear everything? Okay. So assumptions. So planners versus searchers. So someone who assumes a lot and descends from on high is like fundamentally a planner. So I got this terminology from, there's a book called The White Man's Verdict, which is very interesting, by a development economist named William Easterly, who used to be like high up in the World Bank. And then he was like disillusioned with it, doesn't believe in development economics anymore. So he like left and wrote this book, basically like destroying the like a Millennium Goal project. And basically like he talks about how you know basically like $40 trillion, some ridiculous amount of money, trillions of dollars have been spent on like development, right? And yet like in aid, so that's in actual aid money over like the past I think like 50 years. And countries that receive aid are not statistically distinguishably better in terms of like basically all economic metrics. Like they're either flatlined or worse, like than the two comparable situations that have not received aid. So the premise being like aid essentially doesn't work as aid is administered. Well, like why is that? Well, it's because you have like a lot of professors and people who don't know anything about actual like programs and the circumstances in which you're applying policy, basically sitting in a room and planning, thinking, okay, well, like how do we fix this, right? Like one of the stories I heard when I was in Ethiopia was talking to this guy who runs a lot of public health programs, telling me about how these people, they spend like so much money on malaria nets, right? Like malaria nets. You'd think that like there wasn't enough malaria nets like to go around, right? Well, the problem is not malaria nets, the problem is getting them to the people who need them. because they just send in like ships, like tons of trucks full of this shit, and they don't know how to get it to the people who need it, right? Because there's no actual like support on the ground. So you'll wind up with malaria nets in these storehouses over time. They're like months, weeks, years go by, and people don't know what they're for anymore, right? So like they have these situations where, you know, if it's like a local economy that relies heavily on fishing, you might have some folks that they realize, wow, this would be really great fishing nets if we could rewire our nets with these things, but they're coated in insecticides, right? So it's like people are getting sick, right? Because it's all because no one understood how to get nets into the hands of the people that need them, because it was a solution in search of a problem, right? The assumption there is that the problem is that we don't have enough malaria nets, whereas the real problem is like we have no infrastructure in any of these communities to actually get like aid to relief to where it's needed. So now you have people getting sick, and like, you know, children, like whatever, they use them as toys, they use them as blankets, all because like, yeah, people just, there was no like communication, right? So that's like kind of idea of like a searcher is someone who understands the context. And so we would, you know, in design research, you call this contextual inquiry, where you hang out with the people you're developing a product or an idea for, and you understand how they work, right? So in the same way, in terms of aid and policy, you're understanding the people you're developing policy and programs for in order to actually serve their needs. And you don't start with the premise of like, I'm a white person with money, I can help. You ask the question, is there anything that I can actually do? So this is a particularly interesting example. So this is a picture from when I was in Ethiopia. So like that on the right, that little canister, that's like typically what like water is carried in, like these big motor oil containers or old gas cans is like what water is like carried around in. Now in Addis, like there's running water, but like in other sort of more village communities, people have to get water. And so if you look at a community that's super impoverished and you diagnose it and you're kind of in a planner mentality, you think, okay, what are the problems of this community? Well, super poor, people are getting sick and dying, and you know, whatever, there's like substandard sanitation, all these things. People are hungry. Okay, so what's the solution? Money, food, right? That's the idea of relief. So there's relief is like just a sort of assuaging problems. Development is actually creating systems and structures within a community to sort of help. So like, oh, relief, we need to give money and food. But like, again, that's making a lot of assumptions and not understanding the problem. So this is a really interesting project. This is called the Hippo water container. And this was developed by like a sort of social design firm team, and it was sort of iterating on over time. And basically, like, this is a much more efficient way for people to carry more water. So what you have in these communities is what you find is if you figure out ways to get water to a lot of like very like impoverished, you know, rural communities, you totally transform these communities, and that's because you have oftentimes women, like the daughters or mothers of the family, are the ones tasked with getting water every day. Sometimes it's 1 to 3 miles. So literally, and they're carrying these like motor oil containers on their backs. So like you have these like young girls that are just walking to and fro all day getting water while the boys go to school, and you know, dad does whatever, and sometimes mom's doing it too. So what you find is that if you put like a well or a more efficient way to get water in a community, you totally transform it, because now you have the girls can go to school, and you know, you have clean water, whatever. But like the fact of the girls going to school is like the most transformative thing on the whole community, because you have an entire, like, you know, likely like 51% of a community that was not previously educated that are now being educated, coming up with really innovative ideas. And so like when you look at the numbers, it's like ridiculous how when you educate the like female population of a community, that just like the standards of living go way up. And you just wouldn't expect that, right? Or maybe you would, but like you look at a community, you diagnose it, you think money, food. You never think like, let's make a water container, right? But that's the searcher mentality. The searcher mentality is, let's understand the community, understand the real systemic problems, and apply this design process, right? The research, ideate, plan, execute, whatever. So this is like this water container, which is obviously pretty self-explanatory. When I was in Ethiopia, I talked to this guy who runs these really interesting programs doing wells, because wells is a really controversial thing, because that's a classic sort of planner mentality of like, what do we need to do to, now like we know that getting water to communities helps them. So, well, you could make these efficient water like containers, or like we have lots of money because we're the West and we're rich, why don't we build wells? Well, the problem with that is when they'll build a well in community is super happy, and they'll come back a year later with all the wealthy people who funded it to visit it. Maybe it's named in their honor, who knows? And the well will be broken, and people will be carrying water again. And they're like, what the fuck? Like, why is your well broken? Our well, It's your well, you built it, right? So it's like, that's literally, it seems like ridiculous, but again, like, that's sort of like, when I first heard that, I was like, that's stupid. Then I realized, like, well, I need to get back in the foxhole and see that, like, this is my kind of culture and mentality, looking at a problem, thinking this is stupid, when in reality, it's just different, right? So the mentality is like, someone else purchases something and installs it, doesn't make it, like, mine, right? Like, if you make it, like, I'm assuming you're gonna maintain it. So in that sense, like, it's also incredibly expensive to import these, like, really, like, synthetic materials and whatever and build it in these other contexts. So, like, typical well costs between $1,000 and $3,000 to build. So this guy I was talking to, he worked with it, he, like, studied it, like, Chile or something. This guy basically made his way of, like, even from, like, 8 to 120-foot water tables, how to, like, use local materials, essentially, found materials, to create wells. So these wells would cost between $30 and $60 in terms, like, but all use local materials and, like, different ways and different landscapes of how to break through the water table. So the main thing he brought to the table was the skills and the training in terms of how to teach people to use, kind of, to build these sort of structures and actually drill into the water table. And the main thing, that was the main costly component. And so he would then go build them and teach people how to build them, and then people would then go to other communities who've been trained, these, like, native folks, as opposed to this guy who's just a Westerner, and then they would actually be able to make money by building these kind of, like, very, like, basic but very effective wells that were also incredibly easily repairable, because if a piece breaks in, like, a really modern well in the middle of nowhere, like, how do you get a spare part there, right? And so the other thing they found was, like, if you built someone even one of these really cheap wells, they wouldn't maintain it. But they tested it, and, like, they kept removing components. So, like, they would charge people for the whole well, and then most of the well, and then some of the well, and they basically, like, wanted to find, like, what is the least we could charge them for that they would still maintain. So they found that there's a washer in, like, in the actual pump that's made from, because it's all made from found materials, more or less. It's from flip-flops. So you cut out a circle from the flip-flop, you cut out a smaller circle, and that's used in the pump. So what they do is they only charge people for the wells for that washer. And that's enough to make people take ownership that it's their well, and they'll take care of it, right? And this was fascinating to me, right? So that's, again, an idea of, like, even a well is a planner solution to a problem, whereas a searcher solution is, well, do people even need wells? Will they take care of them? And is there a way to build it economically in a sustainable fashion and also promote local business? Because now you have people running businesses building these wells. Now, the problem with all this, and this is a quote from a really good book, an essay, basically on this idea of what he calls it strategic design, which is sort of design applied to policy. The problem is that, like, how do you prototype policy, right? Like, we can prototype an app, you can prototype an industrial, like a product, right, a physical product. But, like, how the heck do you prototype policy? Because you have a limited number of time in office. So if you're a politician, like, hey, we're testing some policy, like, with everyone, like, that's not a very good way to get reelected. So he's talking here about, like, the idea of failure is, like, really big in, like, kind of, like, startup culture, whatever, like, fail fast. But, like, that's kind of problematic for design. So in design, like, you don't really think about it like failure, you think about it like prototyping. But prototyping is usually done in the studio. You usually don't release products that are shitty, right? Whereas the startup kind of mentality is, like, sometimes you do release things and see how it goes. But, like, the design thinking way is we prototype, we research, we evaluate, whatever. But how do you apply this to policy? I think it's interesting to think about, like, what would it take to actually be able to kind of prototype policy? I think it would take a perception of policy as not, like, as mutable, and that, like, if you look at some contemporary things, like that, you have to work with people, and if you're in the foxhole with people and you're with your sort of constituents, then, like, they'll probably be more receptive to the idea of testing things as opposed to, like, never talking to constituents and then just, like, implementing something and then everyone's pissed. So, like, okay, so then there's also, so this is sort of like the public policy level, and I kind of want to, like, just quickly wrap up so we can sort of discuss different things. But, like, so then I think about sort of, like, what is, like, the lower level from this? So this is the huge, right? But, like, what about, like, organizationally? So a book I would recommend reading is the book I put earlier, Changed by Design, by the guy named Tim Brown. And he tells them basically that's from a studio, IDEO, you guys heard this, is like legendary design studio. And he talks about basically applying these ideas not to policy or huge systemic problems, but to, if you can apply that to really any system, right? So like an organizational system. So they were hired to help a medical, medical institution, whatever, a hospital, improve some of their policies and create a strategic internal unit to do design projects. So one of the things they looked at, and again, you're not designing like beds for people to sleep in, like whatever. You're not designing traditional products. You're designing systems, like service design. So this is what we talk about when we talk about design thinking. We're not talking about the design of things. We're talking about the design of ideas, systems, relationships between people. So what they found was like that the shift change was like one of the biggest problems for patients and nurses. You'd have nurses going home late, their morale was low because they needed to communicate to the people who had their next shift what is the status of all of yours and my patients. So they would find that people would not write things down. They'd write down Post-it notes. They would write it in a log. Sometimes they would scribble it on scrubs on their way out, right? But regardless, things were not being communicated well. Sometimes they would do it in person, but then someone has to show up early. You have to debrief them. Then you show up late, so your morale's low. Stuff's getting lost that the patients care about. So things aren't getting communicated to new nurses that the patients really feel as though this nurse needs to know. So now everyone's in a bad state. So what they came up with instead was, they found that if you do your shift change in front of the patient, you dramatically improve the entire system, because then now the conversation is happening in front of the patient doesn't feel left out, they can add in details they feel like need to be said, they're more confident in both nurses' ability to actually administer stuff, and then the nurses are getting home on time. Like that's what the first thing I found was like people are always getting home on time. And then they created a software way for them to like proactively record notes as they go through the day, so that way they're not at the end of the day thinking, oh shit, like what happened today that I need to communicate to these people. So this is an interesting example of like organizationally sort of applying design thinking to like how can we evaluate existing processes in an organization and identify the real problems, because like again, like oh patients aren't happy, nurses aren't happy, well let's put like cupcakes in the boardroom and like get fluffier beds for the patients, right? Like whereas if you really understand the perspectives of the patients and the nurses, which is what they did, they really heavily researched it, you understand that there are these more complex problems. So that's what you apply then sort of like these iterative approaches to. And also it's much less sort of costly in a resource sense and sort of public image sense to like test things in a hospital than test public policy, right? So here like the stakes are getting lower, right? So then talking about sort of at a lower level, like how can you sort of design your life? Like how can you apply design thinking to your life? And I would say the biggest thing is just like, obviously I don't have any answers, but for me it's just been like being open to ideas and testing things. So like if there's something you're not certain about, rather than like stopping and thinking like, okay, what should I do? Just be like, okay, well, what are some ideas? Let me jot some ideas and let me try it. Like for me, one of the things that's been like totally like transformative is like designing my Twitter feed, which sounds ridiculous, but like I follow people on Twitter that like I never would have thought I would, that are like sort of like their perspectives initially seem super abrasive and controversial, but then like over time, we realize like again, that sort of foxhole experience, you start to see people for who they are and you start to be open to their ideas in a way that if you just saw like a drive-by retweet or you saw a quote in the news, like you wouldn't be open to those ideas, right? So it's just like, for me, that was super transformative. And that's sort of like, I try to follow, unfollow people, test people, see, is this someone's perspective I think is valuable or interesting on whatever. So like, just try that out, right? I did the same thing with like to-do lists. Like I was like, no to-do list works well for me. Let me just try a bunch of them. And so you keep planning and whatever, like, but most importantly, like identify your actual problems. Don't like say like, oh, that looks like a cool to-do list. Because again, that's a solution, but in your life, it might be in search of a problem. So just like, for me, in terms of applying sort of the process of iteration and critique to your own life, it's sort of just like, make sure to test your assumptions, because, you know, like, you might, like, be looking at, like, okay, which thing should I do, but then, like, as you select one, you're going to realize the pitfalls of it. So don't be so frustrated by one thing or another. Don't be so committed to one thing or another. So yeah, I sort of, like, said that we were going to talk about public policy organizations in your life, but really it was, like, mostly one, and then, like, those two, because I didn't have much, like, time to prepare slides, so. Yeah, but I figured it'd probably be good to like talk, so try to, yeah.
So I was curious, so going off of like your hospital experience, I also read that another system change that they found is simply listing out the instructions step by step for doctors doing procedures.
Oh, the checklist manifesto, yeah.
And just that alone, like even though you expect the doctors to know exactly what to do, just having them listed out made it like
exactly,
the complications way down.
Yeah, they like, I know what you're talking about, they like kind of learn that from like flight, like pilots, and like pilots have like these ridiculously regimented checklists. I'm sure someone else knows more about this than I do, but like basically they took that idea and applied it to other disciplines of like these, you know, the air rates relative to flights are like incredibly good. Like how can we take those processes and apply them elsewhere? So, yeah.
And then, have you ever seen the site like Everyone Deserves Great Design or something?
I've like seen different types of like movements like that, and like there are a lot of companies that really like.
Yeah. I think I can send it to you, but I found
Sure,
I found this a while ago, and he was talking about kind of relevant to what you were talking about, the water pumps. So like they had like a kiddie wheel water pump, and it's just bad design because you're like, oh yeah, the kids will play on it and spin it, and like as they're playing, it pumps water up. But then like nobody uses it, and it ends up being more work because then people, like a single like woman is just walking around.
Yeah.
But it's, he talks about designing for the common man, and like it's really it was interesting.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, there's a book I have here that I got. There's like a lot of really interesting books, really interesting examples from. It's called Design Revolution, and it's basically like this woman who started this like consultancy that specifically like works like equipping like nonprofits and other stuff to do design work like for social good. And a lot of the projects I talk about are super interesting. We'll have stuff like that but yeah, it's just, that's why like another, people made an assumption this is a thing that people are going to participate in, but you really have no idea. So.
Can you name any major additional assumptions you had that were changed based on like, I guess, empathizing with a specific person you met?
Yeah, I would say, like, in general, I would say I've become more sympathetic to like most people. Like I've become more sympathetic to like disgustingly like rich people who are intent on like whatever, like for whatever reason, like wreaking havoc and gaining wealth. Because it's like it's sort of like characterized as a bad thing, but like at the end, you sort of have an idea of like someone or someone's dad is like a dick, and then like you meet them and like a nice person, you just sort of like your values aren't the same, and you realize like it's not that this person is bad, I just have different values, and like that's important, right? And like likewise, I think like my assumptions going into Ethiopia were like absolutely shattered, that like well-meaning people are actually well-meaning. And you realize like, I don't know, for me I just realized a lot of people do things, like a lot of people wear like bracelets for causes or push shit like for reasons that have nothing to do with the actual thing, like, but to a ridiculous degree, like talking about like the way that certain organizations get aid money is based on like, you know, these people write these proposals and these grants like, oh, we're gonna give AIDS education to 1 million people. And so like, they run these shitty programs, and by the end of like, whatever, their time, like 2 months are up and they need their budget renewed, and they wanna ask for more money, and they've only educated 20,000 people, not 1 million. So they put up billboards, and then like everyone they sit there with a clicker, and everyone who drives by, they like do the math and just like basically say, oh, we educated 1.5 million people on about AIDS because we put up a billboard that says to wear condoms. And so like shit like that happens all the time. Basically that was sort of blew my mind. Like this guy who'd been like working on the ground, who was like doing public health programs for like 20 years and has like a PhD in development economics, and again says I don't believe in it, was just telling me story after story of just like how basically every organization you think is good is like just really full of shit. And it was pretty insane. So yeah, I would say like most of like my assumption that like you know like you see stuff on you see like someone do a good thing, you're like that's a good thing, whatever. Like they gave to this organization. It sort of like makes me skeptical of NGOs in general. So I would say that is one thing. I also like had a lot of assumptions that like I learned a lot of myself. I would say too. Like I assume, like you always assume that you're right, you know, and that you're well-meaning. And in reality, like when you look inside, you realize like most of what I do is just because I want to feel a certain way about myself, not because I actually care about the things that I'm saying. But hopefully I try to minimize that.
So it sounds like a lot of what you learned was that not everything is egotistically motivated. And well, that makes me want to ask you then, where do you see altruism fitting in design?
Yeah, I mean, I think like a lot of like, again, I'm not really like well versed enough to really speak to that, but I think like a lot of the ideas, like a lot of like sort of core things about like doing like social design, like whatever you want to call it, like design, strategic design, a lot of things that make you feel really good. Like you watch the clip about Bogota and like you feel good, right? Like you feel good about these, you know, the water pumps and stuff. And if you do something like that, like you feel good. Like one of the most proud things I've ever done was designing, like building a web application for this woman who worked at this company, and like her job all day was like to enter data, and it was a really shitty app she used, and so we remade it. And I sat and watched her for a day just work, and I made something that was way better. And like I was like, yeah, you know, that's good. And I don't know why. Like you say like, if you do the kind of like childlike asking, well, why? Well, why? It's like, because I say like, oh, I'm happy about that. Well, why? Well, because it made someone's day better. Well, why? Well, because I like making people's day better. Well, why is that good? You know, I don't know. So I think, yeah, like maybe that's the sort of underlying thing that makes a lot of people feel good about making other people happier or making their day better. So maybe that's what it is. I don't know, but there is definitely something that I can't always rationalize that feels good about doing that stuff. And that's why I sort of had to construct for myself like a selfish conception of what it means to do strategic design. So does that make sense? If that's sort of that base layer that we don't really know why you feel good about helping people. Brendan?
So I have 2 questions, but 4 are just your thoughts, because I think these are tough questions. The first question, how do you, especially for areas that are kind of like foreign to you, and maybe you know there aren't many outlets for you to get advice from, how do you determine whether you're satisficing or whether you're selecting outcome when it comes to design?
What was the last part?
How do you determine whether you're like satisficing and just picking the first best solution that you find versus choosing the optimal solution?
Well, I would say you very rarely just like, you know, whatever, go with like something that's not good. If you are doing like contextual inquiry, so like, and if you don't know, if by the end of a project you don't know anything about a particular domain of knowledge or culture, then like you've failed, right? As far as I'm concerned, because if you have come up with a solution without understanding the people and context and culture you're designing for, like yeah, in my opinion, you failed. So if you come out of it being like, I'm not sure, then like you failed. If you've done something that's good, you will have like 10 basically like a trail of 10 not failed ideas, but 10 like alternative ideas that you realized we're just overlooking some huge thing or we're not applicable to this context. So I think like in terms of how do you actually do it, you just get to know the people and context which you're designing for. And that doesn't mean reading on the internet. It means like hanging out with people, watching them work. Like if you're building something for people in a museum, you have to go to a museum, you know, like you have to understand the context in which something's going to be used. So.
And then the second question I have is back to your, what I'll call your Venn diagram of existence, where you basically have like a hierarchical layout of how things would work. I think the thing that really intrigues me is determining whether something is like a proximate cause, whether it's an ultimate cause. And I wonder, you know, because I think you sort of mentioned, you know, how does the outer realm sort of affect the graphics or the architecture or the industrial aspects that you're talking about? Is there any sort of like psychological impact that maybe the architecture choice that you made that was based on something higher can reflect back into something? And if that happens, if you're trying to find a new solution for something, how do you sort of determine if that exists, and how do you undo maybe some effects that might seem unusual? If that makes sense.
Yeah, that's really hard. I think like in terms of that, certain things for the outer circle, I'd say like most often you find like policy, so like that outer space representing like policy and the forces that govern the inner things. A lot of times those things are reactions, right? So if you think about like city zoning laws or like things like that, those usually don't, it's not just like someone's like, oh well, we should really like seriously add some building code because something bad is gonna happen one day, right? It's usually like something truly terrible happens and then you react, right? You add policy, you add code, whatever. Or like someone's trying to build a building or someone does build a building and you realize you don't want anything else to really be that terrible, so you implement zoning, right? So I think that a lot of times it's actually one of the problems is that policy is very reactionary in nature. So I would say like, yeah, I find there is definitely, you're right, there's a relationship between that, and it's oftentimes a reactionary one, or one that's informed by like other things. So was your question, how do you determine?
Yeah, like just in the context of maybe if it's trying to find a solution, or if it's your own self-reflection of why are things the way they are, how can you sort of determine, you know, is it why you're just looking back in history, looking into the past and trying, you know, just like, again, sort of alluding to you're just asking and being involved in the environment? Yeah,
sure. So I think like, I think understanding the history of a particular context is super important. So if you're talking about rural Africa, there's like a very not nice history of why certain like conditions are certain ways around the world. And I think that should also inform your understanding too. Like, for example, with like what's going on, you know, in Baltimore, like it's very easy for a lot of folks who aren't very well read to take a particular stance without really being like, okay, like what are the underlying socioeconomic pressures? What is the history of this place? Because I think if you really took a hard look at certain things, you'd realize that like the assumption that like certain people are predisposed to behaving a particular way is actually like way worse than just taking responsibility for like, okay, this history played out the way it did, you know? So yeah, I think really examining that stuff is important.